It's early February, and it's a random day, and the kids all walk into a classroom, and they see on your desk a pile of papers. They say, "What is that?" And you're like, "Oh, don't worry, it's not a pop quiz. It's a pop midterm." Unprepared, all of a sudden, I'm going to give all of you a cumulative test covering everything you've ever learned in my course. Just imagine it, right? Imagine the kids' reaction, but you make them take it. Now imagine grading it later in the day and how the grades would look. All right, now hold that thought. I'm going to return to it in a little bit. My own story is that I taught math for 20 years, Algebra 1, 9th grade. As a beginning teacher, I didn't know a whole lot, but I gave it all I had. I love those kids, and I believe that that's the most important thing. However, you do need some technique as well. So that year went really well until I gave the final exam that first year, and I was unhappily surprised. I thought the kids understood the content. They'd passed the tests, but when they got to the final exam, only 2 of them got A's and B's. A handful got, scraped by, and the vast majority of my students, the students I had bled for, essentially, failed miserably. So I didn't see that coming, and I was like, what the heck? How could I change my practices to do better? Now, I will say, I believe there are many ways that you can be an effective teacher for long-term retention. Teach the concepts and ideas, not just procedures. Foster student discovery with good challenges. Don't just shove ideas at them, right? The one I'm going to talk about is just a change that I advocate for how you use your typical day. When I was a new teacher, my typical day was made up of a lesson. That, if you made a pie chart showing the minutes of my day, that was most of my period. But then, of course, I didn't want them to walk out the door until they proved they understood. Like, I needed to make sure every kid actually mastered that day's lesson. So I had a section of time for practice. This represented a typical day. Let's take that and show it as a typical unit. New material, practice. New material, practice, and so on throughout the unit. Of course, at the end of the unit, what's going to happen? You give the test, right? And if you're going to give a test, what do you have to do? A review day. Come on in. So this right here represented my basic pattern. I'm telling you already, right, it didn't work. There was actually one little thing at the end there. See that little slice there? You can probably guess after the test. What do I want? I hand the test. Yeah.
Back over.
Yeah. What did you miss? Let's go over it. And some kids would really engage, and a whole lot of my kids sure would not. So I call that learning from your mistakes. So this pattern, I tried it and it didn't work. And over the years, as I examined why isn't it working, I think I kind of discovered in a reality check that this wasn't what I thought it was. I called it review. Now I no longer call it review. Let's think about what it was. I needed the kids to pass the test. I would do anything it took. Games, activities, review, whatever, dry erase boards, I don't care. Let's jam that stuff back in their heads. This stuff here has already fallen out of their heads, or it's been confused with this stuff and this stuff. So let's separate it back out, jam it in their heads. Okay, hold it together, kids, take the test now. Well, you know what a better word to characterize all of that is? I like to use the word cram, because that's what was really happening. We were cramming it in their heads, they'd take the test, try to survive, and then afterwards I'd hand the test back. For them, they didn't care, because I like to suggest that the minute they walk out the room after the test, like they give you the test, they leave the room, something's already happening in their brain. I call it the flush, because like they took the test, like now fate's gonna speak. Maybe they'll pass, maybe they won't, right? But the unit is over for them. They held it together long enough to take the test. So let's take this pattern, which is, I believe, what happens in many classrooms, and extend it to a whole year and see how ineffective it is. This is 1 year. Unit, etc. At the end, there's going to be a big test, and we're using the cram and flush model. So the first unit feels like it went okay. The kids actually passed the test, but this happened. So the next unit, yeah, the kids take the test, but again, there's a flush. Already, this material is fading away. As you keep pushing forward, you keep taking up, it's like you're taking over new territory, you're losing the old territory. So as time goes on, by the time you get to the late middle of the year, the first units, they're not just faded, they are gone. You get to the end of the year, here's what would happen. We're gonna have a big test, right? Your STAR, your final exam, whatever. I'd take a couple days to cram, not just 1 day, maybe 3 days, right? Like, let's cram it in. I'd hand out material, they look at the material, and you know what they would say to me? You never taught us this. Is this going to be on the test? That's not fair. and it was on this test, it was on this test, but it's not in their heads. And I taught 14-year-olds, and if they looked inside their heads and couldn't find it, then it was the teacher's fault, right? It really was gone though, right? Fully and truly gone. So you could cram for 3 days, you could cram, and some people do for the stars, okay? I won't do a show of hands, but people cram for weeks to try to get the kids to pass the stinking test. But what I'm trying to tell you is, maybe they'd pass the test, maybe they wouldn't, but you know what? 2.5 months later, when they come back to school, you know what they're gonna have to spend a month and a half doing in the next course? Reviewing your material, the stuff they're supposed to know. So I call this the cram and flesh, and I like to say, it doesn't work. We keep doing it because it's all we know, but let's talk about maybe one way you could change your practices to try to address this issue. And it comes back to what I say is the typical day. That day where you have a lesson and then you practice the new material. I think something's missing. I think that we need to spend more time and attention on what we know about the brain, which is that it's efficient. It sloughs off old material if it doesn't need it. So I suggest that we change how you slice the pie of your minutes to add a new idea. And that is today to say mixed review. So I advocate that every day, on a typical day, you dedicate some time to each student practicing old content. Now that's not a new idea. You guys do warm-up problems maybe? So you give a test and you grade it and you're like, oh, I kept marking number 7 wrong over and over again. So then you do some warm-up problems that have like that idea. And that's okay, but I'm talking about something way different. I'm saying let's elevate mixed review to be a top-tier contender for what happens in the classroom. If you just take new material over and over again, they're going to lose the old stuff. Let's keep bringing it up. Let me drill down a little bit. I mean a good-sized chunk of time on a regular basis, I say at least 3 times a week, that's dedicated to long-term attention. The 2 things that I like to advocate is that it's cumulative. So you're not just giving like 10 of the same kind of problems. Like 2 weeks ago we learned this, let's do 10 of them. So instead I say a problem from last week, a problem from a month ago, a problem from 3 months ago, a little bit of everything. And then secondly, ideally it's individualized. You remember my example about number 7 being the most missed problem? Let's say like half the kids in the class missed number 7. Well then half the kids in the class did not miss number 7. Those kids actually don't need to go over that a bunch. They're okay. So ideally, the mixed review would be a session that's designed per kid, tailored to their needs right now at this day. So that's the thing right there. If you're a teacher, you're thinking, well, that's not possible. I have 140 kids. I'm supposed to make a 20-minute practice session per each one of my kids based on each kid's needs, right? That's where I'd like to say a computer can step in. To be clear, I don't want to replace the teacher. Our software doesn't do any teaching whatsoever. We believe the best teacher, the most effective instruction is delivered by a person, not by a machine. But what a machine can do is take care of these aspects. It can deliver targeted practice, it can deliver mixed review. So that's what Get More Math does. Now this talk isn't about Get More Math, it's about this vision of let's do mixed review. But let's look at what can happen if you adopt a day in which there's 3 parts, lesson, practice, and mixed review. We're going to run through the unit again. Here's the unit, right? Of course, at the end there's a test, but it has some delightful surprises. My last year of teaching, I never had a study day for any test ever. Not one day. Not a review day, not a cram day, ever. So if that's the test, you know what's going to happen this day? A regular day. On this day, I taught a lesson, we practiced, and we did mixed review. Now, to understand how that could possibly happen, first understand that I did not test the immediately recent material. In other words, this test never covered the most recent days. It would always reach back to earlier. So my very first unit was a tiny test. It only covered 5 days of content. But hold for a second, let's go to the year. Unit, unit, unit. So there's the unit we just looked at. Let's jump forward. This test, see the orange dot getting bigger? That's because I gave cumulative tests. This test, the kids would walk in, have no review whatsoever. It covered all of this and all of this. The next test, or jumping a couple ahead, 4 units away, it covers almost everything they've ever learned. You can see my orange dots are getting bigger. Now remember, no review whatsoever. They would walk in after Unit 4, I would say, here's your test, they would take it and they would do fine. Remember my imagination experiment? Some of you weren't here, but we did a little imagination experiment at the beginning. I said, imagine your kids coming in the middle of the year and you just give them a midterm with no preparation whatsoever. What would happen? And pandemonium would break out and you get calls from the parents and your administrator would be like, what's wrong with you? I'm telling you, my last year of teaching, that's what I did. My kids came in on that day, we had no studying, no cramming, and they did better on that midterm than my kids would ever have done when I was a beginning teacher and I wasn't using this model. In fact, let's push it all the way to the end. This test, oh, by the way, see how the orange dot stopped getting bigger? There's a limit to what you can do in a single, like, non-test scheduling test, right? I couldn't keep making the tests bigger, but they were always mixed. So this test endeavored to cover core concepts from the whole year. My kids were totally accustomed to that. So when they would take a test, this test that we call the big test, it's a star, it's a final exam. For my kids, it wasn't so big. It was just another test. They were used to taking large tests that cover everything. That was their expectation. And furthermore, I keep saying over and over again, we didn't study for it. It's true. No review days whatsoever. But here's my favorite slide. The whole talk is built to this moment. Ready? They actually had been reviewing every day the entire year in a mixed fashion. So their brains were accustomed to doing all the math. They had actually learned the material. So my kids got to the end of the year and they could take the test and pass, not because we'd shoved it in their brains last minute, but because they actually had it in their brains. It was there and accessible and they would do well. So this is the big picture that I'm trying to advocate. Look what would happen if you made mixed review a top tier contender for your usage of minutes. Social advancement, so they'd be socially advanced, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, they'd get to my class and like know almost nothing about mathematics. And yet, my last year, almost every single one of my kids, without a single cram day, got A's and B's on the hardest test I ever gave. Some kids still just scrape by, and this is not a magic cure-all. I still had some kids fail, you know. It doesn't matter what you do. If you're I deal with a needy population, and it just your heart goes out for all of them, and it doesn't always work out. But this is a complete inversion. My first year, these kids were all down here, right? Almost all my kids failed. And I think that while the relationship matters the most, caring about kids, teaching the concepts, fostering student discovery are also vital. But this is the key that unlocked it for me, making sure that in my normal days, I was always allotting a significant time to mixed review instead of just always pushing ahead to new material. This is my story. I thank you so much for stopping by and giving me a chance to tell it to you. As I said, it's not about the mechanics of my tool, Get More Math, but you can see that accomplishing this is something a computer can do well. So that sort of gives you the framework. So if you were to use Get More Math, now you can understand how the vision is formed and how to be effective in using it, instead of just having a tool and sort of like, I don't know, what do you do with this? Where do you click? So, thank you. Appreciate you stopping by. If you're interested in knowing more or actually seeing the program itself, we have people here and we